Welcome to the Friendly Meeples Lounge, the podcast all about board games, new and old, weird and fun, and our thoughts and feelings on their playability. I'm your host, Jen Florez.
And I'm your host, Chris Ingold.
Welcome to another episode, and we're just going to kick straight into it. It's just Chris and I this week, no guest. What have you been playing this week, Chris?
Well, this week, without giving away one of the great secrets about this week before too early, last week we were both playing Echidna Shuffle. So I finally managed to get a copy of Echidna Shuffle, and it was my son's advanced 16th birthday party. So we were hidden a run, playing what is got to be, Jen, do you agree, now the cutest game?
The cutest, most evil game in the world. It really, I feel like we need to do an episode all in itself for cute, mean games. But yeah, it definitely had us all being very strategic and moving our echidnas in odd ways. It's very, very funny. If you've not seen it, you definitely need to jump online, have a look at some videos of Echidna Shuffle, see if you can get yourself a copy. It's so good.
I've also been playing a little bit of Darkest Dungeon this week, just solo, and having a little bit of an explore through that. And that turned up a week and a half ago because I bought it late rather than backed it on Kickstarter. And it's a lot of fun.
Really?
Really straightforward and really simple. It doesn't seem that simple when you pick up the big, fat, not very well-written rule book with no index, which is, I know Mythic Games have been in trouble, but I believe it's typical Mythic Games anyway, to be a bit of a mess there. But the actual game is really, really fast and runs really quickly. They could have probably got rid of a whole load of bloat from the game, but then the old Mythic Games model was to put as much bloat in as possible, which is one of the reasons why they've been in such trouble. But Darkest Dungeon has been a lot of fun, and it has some of the most beautifully sculpted plastic miniatures of any game that I own. But there's no way in heck I'm going to paint them because there's like 120 of them, which is just too much. I've got enough of a pile waiting to be painted of other games. So I think Darkest Dungeon is going to stay grey, or at least the baddies are going to stay grey. It's possible I might paint the heroes at some point. But they are phenomenal and quite striking. So that's been entertaining. And it's also the kind of game you can just sort of pick up and do a little bit of. Yesterday, for reasons that will become clear in a little while, I was sat on my own in a corner with Chapter 2 of The Emerald Flame. So something that I know we will need to talk about in future episodes are those sorts of games that try and be like an escape room or a puzzle room in a box. And, whether you talk about your unlocks or whether you talk about your exit games or so on. There's a company called Post Curious who make what they call puzzle tales, which are mildly story-driven, sort of escape room type games. They'll have potentially a bunch of chapters or a bunch of mechanisms to split the games up into 3 big puzzles, 4 big puzzles, a whole load of tiny puzzles in the case of The Light and the Mist that's based on a tarot deck. And where they specialise is in making something artistically beautiful, and by beautiful I mean incredibly beautiful. So they're so imaginative and so expressive in how they're done. They're also quite tricky and quite tough. So I worked through the second chapter of The Emerald Flame, which has sort of 3 relatively straightforward puzzles by their standards, and then 1 longer, more elaborate and really, really satisfying puzzle, which involves things like rosary beads and a map and cutting lots of stuff up. And I shouldn't say any more than that because I think that's just that doesn't tell you too much. But their games are phenomenal. And I managed to get through that, and I was really proud of myself, again, for reasons that will become clear later.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're definitely sounds like an interesting set of games. I'm all for a good puzzle game. I love the Unlock series. I think those are very fun. I love a good escape room myself. But yeah, Chris and I definitely, you may have noticed listening to this podcast, we have a lot in common. We're both from the north of England. We both absolutely love board games, if that wasn't really obvious. We both love wine and cheese. We're both massive gin fans. And unfortunately, last Saturday night at Chris's son's birthday party, we all got COVID, which is not great. So This is first time for me having COVID. I have to say I'm not a fan. Not a fan at all. I have spent the last week basically asleep 90% of the time, and I had no idea that you could sleep so much and still feel so exhausted. It's crap.
It is rubbish, and unfortunately, this isn't news to most of you or most of us. I'm on either time 2 or time 3, and it's surreal because I've got a much easier run of it than Jen this time. I was a lot more pepped up. I managed to complete a chapter of the Emerald Flame yesterday with COVID. Last time I'd had COVID, there is no way I'd have been able to, I think, stick together a small 8-year-old's Lego set, let alone be able to sort of play any kind of a game comprehensively at that point. So that was doing well. But it's a really freaky thing, and it hits everyone differently. And this morning I've been completely sort of spaced out and feeling all sort of weird and wacky and trying to keep my head in order to thinking about board games, which helps. But it is just exhausting. We were thinking about what is the impact that COVID's actually had on games. Like, we know that it's had a massive impact on the board game industry and on the world economy and shipping rates and all of that. But what's the impact that COVID's had on games themselves and how we appreciate games themselves? And we were talking, weren't we, Jen, that the very first game that was dramatically impacted by COVID was released way before COVID. And in fact, we both received for Christmas a few months before the pandemic started.
Yeah, it's so funny because literally when Chris and I were saying we definitely have to do this as a podcast recording, I was saying I'm going to save for you the tale of how we came to play this game for the recording because it's just too funny. And actually turned out in that Chris giving me some information, we found another thing we have in common. So for Christmas 2019, Joe bought this game for Chris. And for Christmas 2019, I bought the same game for Rod for Christmas. So the game that we're doing this week is Pandemic. Because, you know, when you're talking about COVID and a global pandemic, what game do you talk about? You talk about Pandemic, of course. And what was actually really, really funny is that Rod and I started playing COVID. We started playing COVID. We started playing Pandemic in February of 2020. And the place that Pandemic exploded for us was South China. And we were playing with our housemate, Erin. And, and everything just sort of seemed to go from there. And literally, I think 2 or 3 days after we'd started playing this game, we started seeing reports on the news about a global pandemic or about this, you know, this horrible disease starting in China. So, Chris, my question for you is, when did you start playing Pandemic Legacy?
So, yeah, we're talking, as hopefully it's clear that we're talking about Pandemic Legacy here rather than vanilla Pandemic. And I also got Pandemic Legacy as a present that same Christmas. We were having some great news at Christmas. The presents were unwrapped under the tree. I was getting all my new games out. A couple of days later, the job offer my wife got in Australia came through. And we cemented that and put in the application, which got us into Australia eventually. That's another very, very long, torturous story. But we got the game out in January after I'd been poorly with an infection that may or may not have been COVID. It was very light COVID. It was too early to be COVID. I'd caught it off my sister, who caught it off my dad, who caught it off an academic that he met at a seminar. The academic had come from Wuhan University to the UK in December 2019, which is why we think that there's a good chance that it was COVID. But officially, it wasn't in the country yet. And I don't know one way or the other. All I know is that actually that was worse than when I had COVID last year, which is worse than when I'm having COVID now. But got to the end of that. Let's get this board game out. So we decided to play Pandemic Legacy. We'd all played Pandemic before. So both my son and my wife, Jo, knew Pandemic quite well. My son at the time was a big fan of Pandemic. He loved playing it. He loved telling us that we were all doing it wrong and telling us how to do it properly whenever we were trying to fight the disease. He was a little bit of a quartermaster, but I'll forgive him because he was sort of only 12, 13 at the time. And we were walking through the game, and sure enough, our first Pandemic Legacy pandemic started in South China as well. Now, just to clarify for anyone that hasn't played it, and this isn't a spoiler because this is like the first 5 minutes of the first
Absolutely
game in Pandemic Legacy. Right. The place that your pandemic starts is a random draw of the cards from any location on the board.
Yeah.
And yet ours also followed the path of the pandemic.
Yeah.
We took Pandemic Legacy with us when we sold our house to move to Australia, only to find out that we were stuck because we couldn't get into Australia because Melbourne was super locked down, Australia was super locked down. We took it into temporary accommodation. We got to the point where the rest of my family said, you know what, this is just too real, we can't finish it. And I finished it on my own.
We basically, do you know what? Pandemic Legacy is the only pandemic I've played. I haven't actually played Pandemic the board game before I played Pandemic Legacy, and I love it. I think it's such a fun game, and we've got all of the seasons of Pandemic Legacy now. We haven't played season 2. We've played season 1 and season 0. I actually really enjoyed both of those. But yeah, we got to a point where I think we were about 4 or 5 games in, and everything had really exploded by that point. So our housemate, Erin, her partner, was able to come over. So I know that during lockdown over here, you could have like one person that was allowed to visit, you know, and if they were your partner or something like that. And at that point, Jay, her ex-partner, was still allowed to come. So all 4 of us had been playing together. And we got probably 4 or 5 games in and went, this is getting a bit real. Like this keeps on happening in a way that is making us like, oh, is this, do you remember that old movie? Was it called The Game? Like from the 1980s, about the kid that hacked into the military base accidentally and started a war or something?
Oh, I was going to say The Game was Michael Douglas, and that was in the 1990s.
But
was
it?
Game, is it something like War Games?
Yes.
The film you're talking about is 80s.
War
I remember
Games.
it. Yeah.
Yes.
War Games.
And we were all sitting there being like, this is a little War Games. I don't know if we should continue. So we actually paused playing for about 3 months. And then we're like, no, we have to find out what happens. We just have to find out. So we came back to it. But it definitely, I don't think we can say too much about the legacy games. I don't really want to spoil it for anybody. But definitely playing those games and having it pop up in the same way for both Chris and I has been very, very funny. And yeah, they're definitely a fantastic style of game, I think, the pandemic games. We went through a little while there not long ago where you just could not buy Pandemic. You couldn't buy Pandemic, you couldn't get the legacy versions. And have you actually heard why that is, Chris?
Well, I was aware that they became very popular at the beginning of the pandemic, and then less so about a year after the beginning of the pandemic, which is always going to be a little bit challenging. But I suspect that was a surprise for everybody, because the normal reaction would be you think, well, maybe we won't play this. But I know certainly in the UK, while we were waiting to move, to start with, you know, lockdown was, it was a change of pace. And while people weren't getting the illness, as long as it wasn't you or your family, then, you know, although there was the sort of fear, it was one of these things that was, right, hold on, this is like a major world event. Let's, you know, kind of just try and ride it out with a little bit of stiff upper lip and put a positive spin on it and try and face up to it. And it's once it becomes a grind, sort of a year after that I think it really got too much. And that became a little bit hard. But certainly there is a risk that, you know, if our pandemic playing was the war games of pandemic, and in fact, you know, the course of the pandemic was relying upon us finishing and defeating that pandemic, then
exactly
we were a bit lax. Yeah, kind of. If we'd have carried on and like not taken months over it, do you reckon we could have like nipped it in the bud?
Possibly. We probably could have, and then maybe we wouldn't have COVID. Maybe this is our punishment for letting the world down, Chris. We should have continued our pandemic legacies and resolved it for the world.
It's a sucky thing, but I think one of the interesting things about Pandemic Legacy is that it does manage to feel like it follows a story naturally.
Yeah.
It feels like it grows. I don't know about Season 0 in that sense, because I've not played 2 either, but I've played 0, and 0 I felt tried a little too hard at times, and I was just tripping up over, oh, hold on, what's this new rule? And I found that a bit tricksy. What did you think?
I think it got to a point where it became so complex that it made it really hard to play. Like we definitely got to a point with it where we were like, we just need to finish this thing. Like it was a chore of just, we can't leave it half done. Like you feel that obligation when you start a legacy game to make sure it is fully played out. But it does have some good mechanics. I think they probably could have executed some of those mechanics in a better way for Season 0, that's for sure. Having not done Season 2 yet, I am curious to hear your take, because I have quite a few friends that have said to me Season 2 is infuriating. And in fact, one of our friends, who is normally a very calm gamer, nothing ruffles them, apparently literally flipped the table playing Season 2.
I've not played Season 2, and everything I've heard about it would echo the experience that your friend has had and has made me not want to try and play Season 2. I also kind of do. If legacy games weren't destructible, I would try and sneakily borrow someone's copy to have a look, because the principle that it starts with, I mean, all that I know about it really is that you start with something that looks a bit like an empty map.
Mm.
And that thing that looks a bit like an empty map kind of implies that, the apocalypse has happened and you're picking up like from the remains of like the end of a pandemic. It's a bit darker. So it obviously wasn't as sort of gung-ho pandemic friendly as playing Pandemic Legacy Season 1 or 0 for that matter in the pandemic itself, because, it starts from a more downbeat position. So the impression I got was that it was trying to stretch that additional step into having something to say, into really sort of leaning into like some of that theme in a way that took over from the rhythm of Pandemic, the fun classic board game that is really family friendly. And makes for a great co-op. So I suspect that's part of the challenge, that Pandemic Legacy Season 2 just tried too hard to do that. Interestingly, there was another game, I think it was at a similar time, but I might be wrong on this one, that Rob Daviau, the creator of the legacy bit of Pandemic Legacy, he had put out his own, not based on anyone else's game, legacy game, called Seafall, that was also incredibly ambitious, and also I think fell flat for very similar reasons. That it lent very heavily into the theme it was trying to tell. It tried to then heavily into making sure you map the story to the theme, which is great, but I think it probably got distracted by not getting the balance quite right, because with a legacy game you are playing the same game again and again and again and again and again, and it's got to be fun each time. But you're also playing the same game at the start. So if you make the game like find its rhythm in game 4, are game 1 and 2 a bit rubbish? Because that's not great. But if you find the rhythm straight away in game 1 and 2, then a game 5 and 6 too complicated, and that doesn't help. So you've got to find the pace just right. You've got to get the variation just right. It's things like Gloomhaven does so well, despite the fact that it's so huge, just because Gloomhaven drips it all in through the characters, through the world. There are so many different variables rather than just having like chapter. There's a legacy game there with the campaign that succeeds, I think, in tackling that But there's something I think went wrong a little bit with Pandemic Legacy Season 2. However, it is still quite well rated. I was just seeing where they are on BGG, because Season 1 was briefly number 1, and now it's down to number 2.
Well, Chris, we have an unopened copy of Pandemic Season 2. Maybe the 4 of us should all play it, and then we can report back later.
I think the 4 of us playing it may be a struggle. I think that Joe may be pandemicked out. but we're certainly worth a look.
I'm sure we can find a 4th player if Joe doesn't want to play it. Hey, maybe we can get Zach in. Yeah, no, he might kill us all too.
Yeah, that's fine. Or we just play with 3. Pandemic doesn't really work at 2, but one of the good things about it is it does work at 3, 4. I'm not sure whether the legacy games support 5. I think they do, but I can't remember.
I think you can have up to 5 players in Season 2. I might be wrong, but it definitely was 4 for, yeah. Oh, you know what's really funny actually is in the middle of us playing, it took us such a long time to play Season 1 because of the pandemic that Erin actually split with her boyfriend in the middle of the pandemic. So we went from a position of having 4 of us playing it to all of a sudden only having us 3 of us playing it. So we ended up still playing his character and just calling him Rando. And we'd just take turns and all moving Rando around the board and making sure that Rando was doing his thing as well, which I know is probably not how you meant to do it. You know, if you're going to play with 3, you play with 3. But we'd started with 4, so we just carried on with, you know, random 4th player who we all played ourselves. And it was quite fun. And we had a lot of fun putting that character through some absolute hell. And we made that character do all the shit things. And it was quite cathartic, I think, for Erin.
Actually, I think that's okay. It's okay to do what you want to do with a board game. You own a board game, you can do whatever you like. But I think it's okay in principle because there's a number of campaign games that have a fixed number of characters and you all have to play them together anyway. So it makes it easier if you've got exactly that many. But if you play through something huge like Madara, that's got 4 characters and it's got 4 characters regardless. You play it solo, you play 4 characters, you play it 3, you have a rando. And Darkest Dungeon, it's not a legacy game at all. It's entirely replayable, but it runs in campaigns. As you go through until you die and then you start again. That also requires a party of 4 characters. So it's almost either a 4-character game or a solo game, or it's a 3-player game with a rando. So there's a whole bunch of games that do that. And I think that also is the thing with games when people play solo in the pandemic. When you played those campaign games like Gloomhaven, you've got loads of people who are playing through Gloomhaven on their own.
Absolutely.
You've got lots of people who play things like Tainted Grail, all these big, epic kind of like quest games. And some of them will have played with just 1 character, but most of them will play with at least 2. And the reason for that is partly that playing with 1 character can be brutal and that these games kill you, which is like unfair. And the game makers will say, it's tough, but it's worth it. The other reason is that if you've just had a delivery of a massive Kickstarter box full of plastic and full of lots and lots and lots of cards with individual decks for all your characters, it's landed in the middle of the pandemic. It's the most exciting thing that's happened since last week or last month even, because nothing exciting is happening because you're in lockdown. This box arrives and you open and unpack all this stuff and then you go, I'm going to play through this massive campaign, but because I'm going to play through it on my own, because I haven't got anyone to play it with me that's allowed to come around the house, then I'm only going to use 1 of these characters and I'm going to leave the others in the box. And you go, this game costs loads. I'm not only using 1 of them. Then the other 3 completely wasted. So then you think, I'll use all of them. And then you go, I can't use all of them. My head will be scrambled. There's absolutely no way I can manage all of them. And I think, apocryphally, most people settle on 2. But who knows? That's almost a question that needs a survey. You know, how many people actually play truly solo in these games? And I'm not sure how many it is.
I definitely think that one good thing that did come out of the pandemic was an explosion of board games with solo modes. I think we should definitely go into that in a little more detail. Coming back to pandemic, I think one of the things we like to hit on with all of the games that we look at is their playability and what we think in terms of their friendliness around, you know, dexterity and colorblindness and neurodiversity and those sorts of things. And I actually really feel like Pandemic as a series of games, they do all of that very well. They're very, very friendly games because they're easy to play. They definitely can drive you nuts, that's for sure. But they've got really, really good pieces in terms of all the pieces are a little bit different. Some of them are a little bit small, which is a bit annoying. I definitely think that, you know, some of the pieces could be just a fraction bigger, but again, that would make for a much bigger box, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they'd have to pack it differently. And none of them commit the crime that are the padlocks in Clank Catacombs.
Oh, definitely not. I do think that in terms of even things like gender representation, one of the really awesome things, like I don't want to spoil too much, but there's definitely some really good customizations you can do for the legacy games that make it very, very friendly for representation in so many ways. Definitely want to, you know, hands off to the makers of the games for that. They've done a brilliant job in making them playable for as many people as possible. There's very good player guides. It's very, very clear what you're doing through the whole game. And even the rule books are very, very well set out. What do you think, Chris?
I think the rules in the Pandemic Legacy games, certainly the two I've played, are incredibly well communicated. And they have to be in legacy games. You know, they are in other legacy games like Charterstone. They aren't in some other legacy games. But the communication being fantastic, I think shines a light on those little bits I referred to earlier in Pandemic Legacy Season 0, where, you know, those bits where the rules just get too fiddly and a little bit of a mess. It's not your communication, it is actually the rules. Because I don't think they're communicated any worse than they could have been. Right? There isn't a simpler way of explaining some of it. And it just becomes like a little bit of a kind of a mush because you've got all these different moving parts and it's a little bit arcane in terms of how they all fit together. But apart from that, which has got nothing to do with the communication, I think the way that they're structured is really good. The way the information flows is really good. You're never really stuck with how to navigate the games. So that's quite straightforward. The only thing you're sort of likely to trip up over is if you play multiple games in succession, in particular, when I was finishing some on my own, if you're playing solo, it takes a little bit of memory to do all the right housekeeping. So when you've got your bonus cards that get shuffled into your deck, your little power-ups, and you're working out how many you've got this round and how many you've not got, depending whether you won or lost last season, and you know what you're going to allocate, what you might want to swap out. It's possible to forget steps like that. The more you've got in your group, the more likely you are to remember because somebody's going to remember each one. The other thing that it very much tells you to do is you get to the end of a chapter and you pause it and you wait until you meet again for the next session before you open up and reveal the surprises that are going to come in the next chapter. We found, but this will be a matter of taste, Jen, so I'm interested in your take on this, that was likely to end up with us not picking it up again. So at the end of a session, we had to open the stuff up for the next box so we knew what was coming and then pack it away so that we could dive in and start playing, partly because then we'd dive in and it wouldn't take us long to go, oh crap, what are all the new rules? We could get playing faster. But also, so we're going, oh, cool, we want to have a go at that. Did you do that or were you well behaved?
We were very, very blessed during the pandemic that we did have three of us. So it was much easier to play other board games as well. So we were being well behaved in that we left everything for the next game, but we kept lots of very good records. So we were filling out everything on the back of the book and we had our little notepads and we were writing everything down as we went to make sure that, you know, we were going through and solving any clues that we were getting along the way. So I think we probably got a lot more into it because we had so much less going on in the real world at the time. So that, I think, kept up the anticipation for us. Plus, it was a good excuse for us for a bit of social time when we really could, because we'd started with the four of us playing. It was a good reason for us to be like, hey, let's get Erin's XJ over and, you know, we'll have another game of Pandemic and So I think that kept us going a little bit more than the anticipation of, oh, we want to try those new rules. One of the things that, because I would recommend for sure, if you can get a hold of a copy of Pandemic Legacy or Pandemic in general, definitely give it a go. But the Pandemic model is being used for a whole bunch of other games.
The Pandemic model is used absolutely everywhere in cooperative games now, and that's actually a bit of a generalization. And it came from, now which one was first? There was a game called Forbidden Island and another game called Forbidden Desert. I can never remember which one of those was first. I think Forbidden Island was first. Forbidden Island was Matt Leacock's prototype Pandemic. It is Pandemic, except it's not Pandemic because you're not actually doing disease fighting. You're on an island and the island's sinking.
Yeah.
So you've got the same thing where you've got this like threat deck and the escalation comes up, and then the whole mechanic that drives Pandemic is from Forbidden Island.
I didn't know
there's
that.
Forbidden Desert. And Forbidden Island is one of those games that comes in a tin. And for those of you that may, for whatever reason, be listening to this podcast and you're board game designers and you're thinking, you know what, it would be really cool to put our game in one of those tins. Right? Don't.
No.
Don't. I'm hexing you from the distance. Please, no more of those tins. They're the most anti sort of shelf stacking things you can get.
They're the worst.
You only have a handful of board games. They're kind of cool, right? They are kind of nice. But one moment you're trying to actually manage your collection, they're a pain. But Forbidden Island and Forbidden Desert, they came in those tins, and they were very sort of mainstream family games. They're lighter than Pandemic, and Pandemic's a light game. So Pandemic's become mainstream. There was a version of Pandemic that Matt Leacock did based on Thunderbirds. That's in Thunderbirds Are Go.
Oh, really?
Where you're basically fighting for international rescue. So this really requires, I think, a certain age. But Thunderbirds was the 1960s adventure by Jerry Anderson, which was absolutely brilliant.
I had the little Matchbox pink limo. I absolutely loved it. Lady Penelope's car. It was the best.
That whole rhythm of how you play a co-op game, like, you know, kind of everyone takes a turn, then you've got the threat deck rhythm, and then you take the turn and you've got the threat deck rhythm, and then your threats escalate up. That has been used heavily in the Pandemic games, obviously, and it's used heavily by Matt Leacock as a designer, but it's been pillaged, stolen, thrown in absolutely everywhere, sometimes effectively, sometimes, in fairness, a little bit lazily.
Speaking about pandemics and how it changed the face of games, I know we briefly touched on before, Chris, solo games. I know that you were saying before, during the pandemic, you really started playing a lot of solo mode.
I'd already been playing quite a bit of solo games, but not as a general thing. I played the solo modes in games to learn them, so I could teach them elsewhere. And often I play the solo modes in a game to teach them to my family, if my family were going to play them, or to teach them to friends and sort of game groups back when I was living in Yorkshire for the same reason. And a lot of games didn't have solo modes, but Scythe had one when I got Scythe, and I spent a while playing with the Scythe solo mode and exploring how that worked. And I signed up at that point to do some playtesting for Stonemaier Games, or for Automa Factory, to be more specific. And Automa Factory is the name of the company that build all the solo modes for Stonemaier Games and for a number of others. And in fact, board game solo modes tend to be called Automas now, which is named after the Automa Factory term, which was introduced by Morten Monrad Pedersen, who is the founder and the sort of lead original designer of the solo modes for the Stonemaier Games and for a whole bunch of others. And in fact, is soon to publish his first purely self-designed game, which has a kind of a theme based in Danish mythology, because he's Danish. So I ended up, almost by accident, I just kind of like got in touch and got started testing solo modes. And the first thing I ended up with was Tapestry. And so about a year and a bit before Tapestry came out, I got all the print and plays, and I started testing the solo mode out for Tapestry and learning the game. Interestingly, I found, and we'll talk about Tapestry another game, I found what everyone else has found out about Tapestry, that you start off playing it and you kind of go, is that it the first time? And the second time you go, ooh, and the third time you go, ooh, and it just gets better and better and better and better the more you play it. It's one of those games that just grows and evolves, and that's it's one of the fantastic things. It's what's made it an evergreen. But I started playing the Tapestry solo mode, which is really well designed, and I was playing a lot of it because I was testing it. And then I tested the Pendulum solo mode, and the Pendulum solo mode is good, but I don't like Pendulum the game particularly. And it was a very challenging solo mode to design because Pendulum's a real-time game. And real-time games, when you're trying to manage a solo combatant, is trickier again. And just to make things really challenging, the playtest egg timers that we got for that had about 5 seconds off the clock on each one, so you had to be faster. I timed them at one point and I said, that's why. I got really into how solo modes were designed from that. So when the pandemic hit, I started looking for games that actually had more deliberately established solo modes, because I thought, well, actually, there were games here that my wife and my son aren't going to want to play, but I want to play them, so let's try and play them solo. And you started to find some solo modes that were fabulous and some that were not so fabulous and some that were just sellotaped on. What every game manufacturer found was that if their game didn't have a solo mode, they were going to be losing Kickstarter backers hand and fist, because the first thing everyone thought when the pandemic hit was board gaming is dead. No one's going to play board games. No one's going to buy board games. Right? The market is going to collapse, because who the hell wants a board game when they can't get together with their group and play? And obviously there's online. This we'll come back to online, but you don't need the board game for that. You use the online tool. So did that happen? No,
I feel like the opposite happened. People went, we've got nothing to do. Let's buy board games for when this eases up. So I know that one of our favourite things to do was to get online and order board games during the pandemic. So our collection exploded from probably like 50 games to over 200 during the pandemic, because we really, and that's something that I have never played a game solo in my life, not one. I play board games for the social aspect, and I don't think I've even been on an online game and played solo. Like, I've always played board games with friends, and that's actually something that during the pandemic, pretty much every Saturday night, we would put feelers out across Facebook to all of our friends and be like, hey, we're online again, and we'd all have Zoom chats and be on, Board Game Arena or Tabletopia and cracking through the games. And it was actually a really good way for us to go and try out some of the games that were out there on Kickstarter. Because if you haven't stumbled across Tabletopia, a lot of Kickstarter games are on there for you to try so that you can see if you want to buy it. So we did spend a lot of time trying out new games and then going and buying them, being like, oh, great, when we can actually play these in person, these are going to be fabulous. Or we could play them in person with Erin because all of us were stuck at home. So it was definitely, for us, a fantastic way of being social. I actually think we were more social during the pandemic online, playing games with our friends over Board Game Arena and Tabletopia, than we sometimes are now post-pandemic. But we definitely ordered a lot of pancake parlour. We drank a lot of cocktails. And we made the most of our stuck at home with crap all to do during the pandemic, that's for sure.
I think I was the opposite, Jen, in many ways. We were sociable online with friends, but it wasn't around board games as much. It was the board game chatter that carried on, and sort of talking to community groups and chatting and exchanging messages back and forth. That was definitely happening. But the play, because for me, so much of it was about the physical aspect, because I like playing sort of video games if I want to play something on a screen, and so many Zoom calls, so much work, everything else being online, we tend to get away from that. What we did do online was have the odd rave or party. So we had people get their turntables out and broadcast and live stream them playing some techno. This is, I guess, coming from Manchester originally. in Manchester maybe it was about sort of 4 or 5 months into the pandemic. I can't remember, but they had effectively a night session where they got a load of performing artists who were really struggling because obviously all their gigs had folded. They had like local DJs in Manchester and also major luminaries in Manchester, like, 808 State and big acts from the Manchester dance scene in the 90s. And effectively they had a 6-hour, sort of 7-hour, 8-hour marathon. I can't remember how long it was.
Oh my God.
Broadcast out, where we all tuned in, we plugged it in on speakers, put it in there because we weren't in Manchester, but I'm born in Manchester, and so that was sort of big for us. And tons of people all tuned in, and you've got all these like major name DJs playing from their bedrooms, streaming in, and it felt so communal because it's a leveler, right? It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter who's like the famous legendary musician and who's just some guy who likes to dance who's sitting in a kitchen, right? You're all on a level because you're all stuck in your house. And that was the thing originally about the pandemic. The pandemic felt like a leveler. It brought people together like that. I didn't get into the online game things partly because I did try Tabletop Simulator, and I know how useful it is for game designers. And I know how useful it is in my own aspirations to design games. And Christ, I hate it.
I hate it.
I cannot get with it, right? So, we talk about fiddly picking up pieces and stuff like that, and, how accessible a physical board game can be in terms of actually being able to manipulate the stuff in it. Anybody that is a ninja in Tabletop Simulator will never spot an issue like that with a board game because they have, like, surgeons' hands. I mean, they are, if you get somebody who plays Tabletop Simulator regularly, I'm never playing Operation against them. Right, they will absolutely slaughter me because I will be useless. And I'll say I can fillet a fish with some abandon. I cannot navigate Tabletop Simulator for some reason, and I have a mental block, and it's like, ugh.
I don't like Tabletop Simulator for the same reason. I think it's way too finicky. But Tabletopia operates similarly to Tabletop Simulator in that if you've never played online for a board game, my recommendation would be to start with Board Game Arena, because in Board Game Arena, all of the rules are already built into the system. So it won't allow you to do something that the board game won't allow you to do anyway. Whereas Tabletopia is literally like you've got the board game out, you've set it on a table, and you can do anything you want with those pieces. However, I find it significantly easier to use for some reason than Board Game Simulator.
Tabletop Simulator is just, you can flip the table in Tabletop Simulator, can't you?
You can flip the table in Tabletop Simulator. You can't flip the table in Tabletopia. But Tabletopia allows you to basically just move the pieces around as if you're playing the game in person, like virtual reality style, which is really fantastic, which is why a lot of Kickstarter games are on there. But I do think it makes it a little trickier to navigate for people who are unfamiliar with board games. So, my recommendation is definitely, if you haven't before, start with Board Game Arena before you move on to Tabletopia. And if you like that aspect of the computer keeps a track of everything for you in Board Game Arena, you may find Tabletopia or Board Game Simulator very frustrating.
Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator they've saved the lives of a lot of board game developers in terms of being able to test their games, because blind playtesting was becoming just impractical, and you could send out print and plays to people to be able to get them set up, but if you're doing anything other than solo testing, it relies upon you being able to gather some people together, which of course you couldn't do. So in that sense, they've been a lifesaver. They have had the impact of effectively meaning that some games have only been tested by people that are comfortable with Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia. That's just a necessary evil. There has been nothing, I think, until the sort of pandemic officially sort of ended and or lockdowns ended, I think it's probably a fair thing to say. There was nothing else they could do, because that was the way it was. If you wanted to test your game, you needed people to play it. How do you get people to play it? You get them to play it online. But we're talking about solo games, Jen, and one of the things that I learned, because I got very interested in how solo games were put together, partly just because I was testing them and many times playing the same solo game again and again and again, reflecting, like exchanging messages back with sort of Morton or David over at Automa Factory about a particular mode, I still do that. So most of the solo mode play I do these days, because I play far more sort of together with other people, is either in me learning a game or is playing solo modes that I'm testing. And the thing that I really learned was interesting was the different approaches that are taken. So you can think about playing Patience in the old days with a stack of playing cards like people used to do, which was just literally you just play until you find out you can't play anymore. And a lot of it was just luck of the draw, just luck of what cards you had. There are a lot of solo modes historically that are just like that. So in your typical sort of Euro games, for a while they've been played so you could play them just as one person, just play through. Right? You play, see how many points you get. And at the back of the guide, it says if you're one player, just play through, see how many points you get. And here's a set of rankings. If you get 80 points, you're okay. If you get 90 points, you're a ninja. If you get 100 points, you're a god. And if you're 60 points, you're a turd or whatever it is. Right? They give you this little ranking and you try and get up the points. And then they might do something to vaguely put in some of the pressure that another opponent would give you. So you'll get games like What a Wonderful World that has a sort of simple interactive sort of thing which allows you to make choices about which cards you're going to draft. It kind of fakes the draft for you. And that's got a similar score chart. A Feast for Odin works quite cleverly in that you basically block your own workers for the next go, so that you can't just keep on doing the same thing. But effectively, again, it's still a score chase as a solo mode, and that's actually quite fun. That's a really good way of learning the game, is to play that. But that's not what Automa Factory tried to do. And the thing that Morton set himself out to do was to try and say, how do I go about trying to get a solo opponent that feels like a real opponent and can start simulating the feeling of that opponent being there, which is not the same thing. Because on those high score ones, you can game it. You can. We talked about a little bit about Feast for Odin last week, just in passing. But when we did so, one of the things that we reflected was that the cards weren't used very heavily. Well, if you take the cards out of it, that takes a lot of the randomness out of the solo mode for it. Feast for Odin, you can play the same game each time. The Automa Factory games try and vary it up a little bit. So what Morton then went on to think about is saying, well, what are the essential kind of touch points that a solo robot, if you like, this kind of card-driven machine needs to hit in order to behave or have the impact that another player would have on you while you're playing, and how can you make that as simple as possible? I mean, that's worked incredibly successfully in a whole load of games, and he is, famous along with David Turtsey as one of the best sort of solo mode designers in the world. And what's interesting is when you compare the different games, which games it has been not necessarily easier for, but which games the solo mode just works like a dream, which games it struggles despite his best possible efforts. Pendulum is one of the ones where it struggles, partly just because it's real time, and that's obvious. But have you played Libertalia?
No.
So Libertalia is it's an old pirate game that then got remastered as Libertalia Winds of Galecrest by Stonemaier with anthropomorphic animals.
Ooh.
And it's a multiplayer card game where effectively you all get the same 6 cards out of a hand of 40. You're all playing them in a different order. You know that you're all going to play out the same selection to start with, and then the selection expands out. But it's very take-batty. You're all trying to grab people, get somebody else to get forced to take the poison curse relic while you walk off with the treasure type things. So it's exactly the kind of game you'd have thought you couldn't make a solo mode for. Libertalia has, in my book, the best solo mode I've ever played. Right?
Okay.
Because it feels like a real person. It's really easy to use. And you find yourself going, I've gotcha, and then this artificial pack of cards does you in with something that feels human.
No.
Now, you can. I play tested it. I will consistently beat that Automa every time because I play tested it. I play tested it a lot because I was having such a good time with it. And that feeling is really, really interesting, because then think about a co-op game where you're playing as a group of 4, but there's an automated big bad. There's the automated thing in like Mansions of Madness or whatever it is, where you've got like the computer giving you your roles and so on. And when an app does it, the app's got a little bit more cunning because it can hide a whole lot more logic in the back of the app. If you've got a human DM doing it, they can do a gazillion things. It's all just down how many of the rules they've learned. But if you've got something quite simple that you're actually managing yourself, there's a lot that can learn from those solo games in how that works. And I'd strongly suggest at some point having a pop at the solo mode at Libertalia just to try it, because that's a great example in a simple game as to how a solo mode can work and actually feel almost human. But the ones he's done for the one for Tapestry is brilliant. The one for Wingspan is superb, absolutely superb.
I've heard Wingspan solo mode is very, very good.
It works well and it helps you learn the game. Bizarrely, I don't learn games by playing the solo mode anymore because solo modes often are a little bit different and so on. If I want to learn a game to teach it, I will take the game out, I will look at the player counts I'm likely to teach it to, reduce it to the minimum to have the same effect, because trying to play like six-handed is a nightmare. And I will play a multi-handed game myself, where I play each role. And I'll play that once, work out what things I trip up over, and understand the game. But I do that partly to explore the game and understand it if I don't know when I'm going to play it, but also to teach it. Because actually that's something else I would recommend, is playing games on your own. If you've got a complicated game and you need to teach it, if you've done that and you go and teach it, you'll give a better teach than if you just read the rule book.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's brilliant.
I think one of the reasons that I've never played a game solo is that if I'm in the mood for playing a board game, Rod's like, yes, let's go. Let's play a game. So whereas if I'm not in the mood and he's in the mood, he'll go and play solo. Like we got Frostpunk a while ago and I feel really bad because I still haven't played it. And he was so excited to get Frostpunk, the board game. So he set it out on the table and had a solo game himself. And he's like, it's really hard. Like it's really, 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 really hard as a solo game to actually beat the game. He said it's very King's Dilemma-esque in that you're given sort of scenarios that there's no win. There's no right thing to do. It's just multiple bad choices. So he said it was very, very good in terms of it felt quite thematic in that everything's really tough. People are going to die. It's just how it is. But I would, that's pretty much the reason I don't think I've ever played solo. My husband gets too excited that I'm in the mood for playing board games and I have the brain space to play something new. So, yeah, maybe I'm going to have to give it a concerted effort to give a solo game a go, I think.
It's worth trying just to see, because it's one of those things which actually initially it's easy to think, well, why would this work? I mean, you get some games that are specifically solo, like you get a game like Nemo's War, which is quite a long, specifically solo game. You've got games like Hostage Negotiator or Final Girl, which is a new version of Hostage Negotiator, which is basically just a crapshoot. Fundamentally, it's like a dice throwing crapshoot, but it is quite fun. It's a distraction. I remember at one point having a copy of Hostage Negotiator as my kind of like, it goes in the bag on a holiday if I get stuck in a hotel room. If I'm like, well, actually not holiday, work, if I'm off on a work trip, copy a Hostage Negotiator in the bag. If I'm going to be stuck in a hotel room and it's crap weather, then that would be something you could pull out and just play in sort of like 20 minutes and then put away. And then I got bored with Hostage Negotiator because it is just a crapshoot. I believe Final Girl is meant to be that much better again, because that's become a sensation, and they are, as I understand it, broadly the same game. But there are some great things. It's worth giving a shout out, and I'm sure we'll look at some of these things in the future, but one thing I really do have to give a shout out to is probably what is one of the best achievements in solo game design, just in terms of it being impressive, which is, so again, this is not a Stonemaier game, but it is one of the Automa Factory solo modes. It's one that Morton designed for one of my favourite board games, which is Glenmore Chronicles 2, or Glenmore 2 Chronicles. So I got it right? Glenmore 2 Chronicles. Glenmore 2 Chronicles being an update to Glenmore, classic old Euro game, but with a whole bunch of bolt-on modules, each one of which takes what's basically quite a simple game and gives it a little bit of extra flavour in a really interesting different direction. So it's modular, and you can stick any combination of modules together just about. And it's one of those rare games where that approach works. Like, it really works. Like, you have the game and suddenly you're racing dragon boats around the side as well, or you have the game and now suddenly you're starting a big whiskey distillery on the side. You have the game, but now you've got bandits lurking around and fighting each other, or you've got like a big Highland Olympic Games going on, all of it at once. So Morton successfully designed an adaptable solo mode. It's not the world's most easy thing to control, and it never could have been. But he designed a successful, playable solo mode that can do any combination.
Oh my God.
I think there might be one slight one that you can't actually do solo because it relies upon something, but every valid combination. And when you actually look at the different combinations of those modules you can use, well, there's like 10 of them. And then you then say, well, you can have any combination of them. In theory, you could play with all of them. No one ever should, right? You should never play with all of them. It's like, this isn't a game where you play with all the expansions. That would be a fool's errand, but it would be possible. So trying to design a solo mode that works consistently and manages all of that flexibility, that's just so impressive that just for its existence, that needs mention, because it's just amazing that you've been able to achieve it. And so if you ever are looking to play Game More 2 and you don't have somebody to play it with, every solo option on the planet is there at your disposal.
Do you know, I think in general, hats off to designers for being so adaptive during the pandemic, that not everybody was as lucky as we are and that we had other people living with us. You know, there were a lot of people during the pandemic who do live on their own and, you know, didn't know anything about Board Game Arena or who didn't feel comfortable getting on Board Game Arena. So I think the explosion of, you know, solo mode for a lot of these different games meant that a lot of people didn't feel quite so alone, which I think is amazing. You know, there definitely have been some really good things that have come out of this situation, which would they have happened without it? Probably not. But at the same time, I think it's been really fabulous for the board game industry that it has been able to be, you know, to keep going through such a challenging time. And I can't wait to see where games go now in the future, that things are a bit more back to normal and a lot more opened up. And yeah, it's... What's next for the gaming world? What's the next big rage other than solo modes? I guess we have to wait and see.
Obviously, the gaming industry is not yet fully back to normal. It's still struggling a little bit with the hangovers from the pandemic, the sort of nastier ones. But it's been such a surreal journey for, I mean, all industries, but it's been such a surreal journey for the board game industry, because first the pandemic was going to kill board games, except it didn't. And then suddenly everyone wanted to play on their own, so everyone needed a solo mode. And then the amount of backers went up and rocketed. So board game publishers were, hey, we're sorted. Everything's fine. But then the price of paper went up and shipping containers went through the roof. And suddenly, if you're the one who'd done a Kickstarter for something that came in giant boxes, you were not just making a loss. If you'd suddenly managed to get 12, 13,000 backers for these boxes, you were making a catastrophic loss. And then the delays in all the shipping centres, the shops couldn't get the games. So even then, as people started coming out of lockdown, we've all seen it, and certainly in Australia, the shops, the demand is there. The games aren't getting there. People are going on to Amazon US and ordering on import. And so those shipping lanes are gradually coming back into order. The shipping prices have started to drop, that they're still pretty expensive to the US. Then what's happened is the US dollar's rocketed. All the shipping's charged in the US dollars. So all the costs that everyone outside the US is paying have stayed up because of the exchange rates. And then we've got other challenges in China, and then we've got a war in Ukraine, which has also affected sort of energy prices around the world. And the board game industry has actually still struggled to catch a break, even though so many things have picked up. The pandemic has, I think, improved that understanding of solo games. It hasn't killed the hobby. In fact, it's grown interest in the hobby.
So
there are
much.
more and more people interested in board games. And that is the thing that I'm pretty much willing to swear nobody expected at the beginning of it.
I don't think so either. Yeah, it definitely, for me, exploded my love of board games even more. It was really awesome during that time. As I mentioned before, this is my first time actually having COVID, and as someone who's immunocompromised, it sucks balls. Like, it really genuinely does. And I wouldn't wish this on anyone. I'm very lucky that during all of those lockdowns, I never was this sick. So my hat's off to you if, you know, you caught COVID when it first came out and it hit you this hard. It's not great. But at the same time, like, I'm grateful for all that time that I had during lockdown to expand on my love of this hobby. And I am glad that we're all coming out of it now. And I'm glad that we're still having this amazing surge in our industry the industry we're all so interested in, of all these new exciting games with new exciting mechanics, and I just want to see it grow even further.
What's really exciting is what's going on in the Australian board game sector at the moment. Sort of designers are picking up a lot of steam, getting back on the wagon and putting out all sorts of great ideas coming up. There's just some fantastic things coming out of our country, coming all the way around the world. So I think it's going to be an exciting few years to watch.
Absolutely. And look, on that note, it's been absolutely fabulous, Chris. It definitely was a bit of a different one today in that we definitely weren't expecting to both get COVID at the same time. But thank you so much for everyone for listening today. We hope you've had as good a time as we have. I definitely have just found myself hitting a brick wall and getting pretty tired. Don't know about you, Chris.
So it does seem, and I know everyone's different, it does seem to get less bad with each time. But COVID's still a weird bug. It throws strange stuff at you. So I didn't lose my taste this time. And that's a blessing. I did. But certainly the last time that I had COVID, I couldn't play a board game. And I was actually in full-on ISO in my bedroom with all my solo games. I had No Man's Sky. I had No Man's Sky. And I had it laid out on the bed. And over the course of 7 hours, I think I played one of its 15-minute runs on the first day. No. But then the brain comes out. So lockdown, it was a great time for playing board games. Actually having COVID, less so. This time around, my head has been clearer. Although I've been poorly so far, I've been more lucid. Anybody listening to the waffle on this podcast may debate that, but I've been a lot more lucid than I would have been last time. This would have been an impossible conversation to have, I think, last time. I guess what we're all hoping is the same thing. We're all hoping over the years COVID just evolves into one of those random other bugs and is indistinguishable from any other cold. It might
I
not.
Hope so.
We're not doctors, we're gamers, but it's, we can hope. Anyway, on that note, at the time that you're listening to this, we should have already had the Melbourne Meeple Market. However, when recording this, we haven't had the Melbourne Meeple Market, which is another great advantage of the COVID timing this year, because the last time I got COVID, it was 11 days before BunnyCon. Just in time to be COVID-proof for BunnyCon and not to screw up BunnyCon. Exactly the same thing has happened this year with Jen and I in the Meeple Market. Yeah. So we will be, given that it's going around a little bit in Melbourne at the moment, we will be, I think, making sure that people feel comfortable, I think, at the market. We at least will be COVID-proof for that event and can help everyone out as need be. And that should be quite exciting. But although it's already happened, you're going to have to hear about it in the next podcast.
Absolutely. And on that note, thank you everyone for listening. You can find all of our social information in the information below. And we hope you have as good time at the Melbourne Board Game Market as we're going to.
Take care.
Bye.